We can accomplish more together than we can alone. Those are the words of Max Dupree. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world you might be tuning in from. Welcome, bienvenido, bienvenue, benvindo. Welcome to the 7th Regional Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in the Americas and the Caribbean, RP21. Today is day 2, and the theme is Building Resilient Economies in the Americas and the Caribbean. We're coming to you live from the Jamaica Conference Center, downtown Kingston, Jamaica, and we wish that you could be here in person, but we thank you for tuning in across YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Hopin, as well as the RP webpage. I am Dr. Terry Carell-Reed, and it is a pleasure to serve you as host over the next couple of days. Now, kindly allow me to acknowledge the organizers who really put all of this together. I'd like to acknowledge the government of Jamaica, specifically the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development, as well as co-organizers, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, or CDEMA, as well as the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR. And of course, we thank all the sectors, the organizations, and other agencies that make up this entire ecosystem. We also want to acknowledge the presence of our translators, our English, French, and Spanish translators, as well as our sign language interpreters, members of the media fraternity. Ladies and gentlemen, all, thank you so very much for showing up for day 2. Now, day 1, we had the official opening ceremony, insightful discussions, solid presentations, tangible and practical solutions. We had a press conference, and we even have a special media training session that is in place for members of the media fraternity, and that will take place up until tomorrow, every single day at 12 o'clock. And we encourage our journalists, our media practitioners to register for that particular media training, just to learn about the appropriate language that needs to be used. So we said that this is day 2, and we just want to announce that today's special event is the Regional Action Plan meeting with members states, and that is going to be a closed event. So we're going to dive right into our new session, our high-level session 2 for today. The title, Building Resilient Economies, Building Back Better and Greener, Leaving No One Behind. And our organizers for this session are United Nations Programme for Development, UNDP, as well as Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC. Our esteemed moderator is Laura Cardenas Lorenzo, Consultant in Communications and Visibility for the area of governance at Eurosocial Plus. Please welcome them all. Do enjoy.
Que se encuentren
to
bien.
you all. We really hope that you have health in these moments which are so difficult. Welcome to this high-level session talking about the importance of building up resilient economies and the opportunity that this moment is for rebuilding to be better, greener, and without leaving anybody behind. Before starting this session, let me walk you through this session. We have a first portion. We're going to have speakers allowing us to provide a better regional, global, and national background. And then afterwards, we will have a discussion on the focal points of this session. We know that disaster risk reduction advancement is heterogeneous across Latin America and the Caribbean, and even more so among each country and among sectors. Therefore, we have today high-level speakers to which we thank you and who will give us a better understanding in terms of regional challenges from a number of perspectives. First and foremost, I'd like to welcome Mrs. Mami Mihitori, special appointee by the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. You have the floor, Ms. Mihitori. Good morning.
Thank you very much.
Laura.
So, you need to start, obviously, from the COVID-19 pandemic, don't we? Which has shed light on the characteristics and interactions of socio-ecological and technological systems that make hazards into disasters with cascading effects. Let's be clear, hazards do not have to become disasters if we make sure that the hazards are mitigated and also vulnerability and exposure are mitigated. But COVID-19 has demonstrated how society's values, demands, and resource management can affect ecosystems, human health, and impede sustainable development ultimately. Now, in this landscape, in spite of it, unfortunately, governments are critically still underprepared to tackle the systemic nature of risk and are underinvesting in and under-prioritizing prevention and resilience. As the reality of climate impacts hit all of us, and if the current approach continues, we will continue to face increased losses and damages from disasters. This will be the tragic future. It is now estimated that this pandemic could cost the global economy $21 trillion, something that could have been prevented with billions of dollars now is costing us trillions. You know it very well in this region, the most affected in terms of economies and jobs. And we cannot understand these impacts without considering that the Americas and the Caribbean continue to be the most unequal region in the world. It is a region where most of its population live increasingly in cities which have been developed informally with degraded environmental situations. The economic impact of the pandemic in your region is consistent with the impact the region suffers as a consequence of all other disasters. The region has 9 out of the 10 countries and territories that have had the highest percentage of disaster-related economic losses in relation to the GDP over the last 20 years. And these are the cases of mostly Caribbean, small island developing states. Even before the pandemic, the region observed 53% of the global economic impact as a result of climate-related disasters. And currently, expenditure on disaster risk reduction is, in spite of all that we just saw, insignificant if it is measured against these impacts. At the global level, domestic public finances earmarked for risk prevention, so something before disaster happens, are, on average, less than 1% of the total national budget. This is a chronic underinvestment in disaster risk reduction. Investing in disaster risk reduction is a precondition for sustainable development in a rapidly changing climate. We know that investing in disaster risk reduction makes good financial sense, but governments still do not prioritize this. Why? Because they see it as a cost, not an investment. They see it as a cost for an event that may never happen or may happen not today or tomorrow, but in 30 years. But when they do happen, they result in themselves. Where financing goes, where money goes, really decides everything. There is no significant evidence to indicate that investment decisions are considering disaster risks at the transaction level. And much of the policies, regulations, accounting practices, they do not mandate consideration or disclosure of the financial impact of disasters. And there is a trend, yes, slowly over the past years of changing this, but the consideration is primarily limited to climate risks, but we know that there are so many other disaster risks. Governments worldwide are now spending an enormous sum of money on the economic recovery from COVID. which will significantly influence our ability to deliver a green, resilient, equitable recovery. COVID-19 has already highlighted the need for more investment before disasters strike into resilience, and the economic stimulus packages to recover from COVID-19 that is going to be happening all over the world. This actually provides a golden opportunity to address multiple risks, including climate change impact and making our societies resilient and prepared for the next shock. And the opposite is also true. If we don't make this recovery green, resilient, equitable, then we are creating new risks. And in order to make the recovery truly green and resilient, it requires coherence in our approaches, synergies and efficiencies in the allocation of where our limited resources should go and how they should go. Of implementing a prevention-first policy across all sectors, all agendas. We must make sure that all investment decisions related to capital investment, social expenditure, environmental protection are all risk-informed. And this is true for both public and private investments. Because if you only look at the picture, trillions of dollars will be invested in the coming years. And 80% of this is going to come from the private sector. So if this is not done, investment in infrastructure is not done in a resilient way, we will be creating new risks, and this will lead to more damage to infrastructure and disruption of basic services when we need them most. We also need to work to ensure that financial institutions and banks, that they align their strategies, operations, and activities with the Sendai framework, developing enhanced guidance, integrating disaster risk into procurement processes, accounting practices, and international and national accounting standards. These are all very critical. And while risk transfer is not the same thing as risk reduction, we also need to create an enabling environment for effective insurance. And we need to narrow the protection gap. The insurance sector could also incorporate risk prevention into their operations to build resilience. Now, these are just some examples of the extent to which disaster risk reduction can be embedded into investment and financing. COVID-19, climate breakdown, make clear that shocks cannot be reduced unless the dynamic and systemic nature of risk is first understood. Second, that good risk governance is implemented. And third, importantly, as we are talking today, that we invest in resilience. Putting into practice the lessons that we have learned painfully from the pandemic means putting forward a coherent implementation all the global agendas, Sendai Framework, Paris Agreement, to achieve SDGs, because we have learned that everything is connected. Putting risk and resilience at the heart of our efforts. And in each sector, this is the only way to achieve the goals that we have set for ourselves toward 2030. And this is the only way that we can address the complexity of the challenge. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, señora Mizutori. Como bien dice, es el momento.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Mizutori. The time, as you are put it so well, to take advantage of this golden opportunity. Next up, we have Mr. Luis Felipe Lopez Calma, Assistant Director in the region for Latin America and the Caribbean for the UN Program for Development. Good morning, Mr. Lopez Calva.
Thank you very much. I want to start by congratulating the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, the government of Jamaica, and CIDIMA for organizing this very important event, and also to thank them for allowing UNDP to be part of this conversation, as we are partners on the ground in the response to many of these events and all these development of these strategies. And also, I'm very honored to share the panel with Mami Misutori, the SRSG for Disaster Risk Reduction, Secretary Gramajo Vilches from Guatemala, and a good friend, Senator Bursako from the World Bank. So I was asked to present in Spanish, so I'm going to switch to Spanish now to share a few thoughts on these issues. And if I can use my presentation, please, I can start. Perfect. So I want to say that one of the main objectives of disaster response, and in general, after this COVID crisis, is how we first prevent shocks that are transitory. Oh, sorry, I'm going to speak Spanish. Choques que son transitorios, cómo evitamos que se conviertan
We're going to avoid them from becoming something permanent. This is highly important, especially from a household perspective. I want to say as well that a main feature is that future is no longer what it used to be. What do we mean by this? Predicting the future has always been difficult, but uncertainty has exacerbated. Well, what does this mean? We could more or less foresee what forecasts were about. Now there is greater uncertainty. It's highly more complicated today to know what the future is has in store for us, because there have been unforeseen events that have become a part of a realm of possibilities, as well as other known events and our understanding, all of which has changed. This is highly important. Why? For example, persistency and natural phenomenon intensity has increased. We have more natural shocks today than a few decades ago, and the effects of these are more important after COVID. And this is information from Philip Shipp on the ABC World Bank. We see that Latin America and the Caribbean region is by far highly most effective in terms of healthcare impact and economic impact. So there are structural components that have made us vulnerable. So on the one hand, we have natural phenomena. On the other hand, we have zoonotic diseases, all of which present us with a much more uncertain environment. The distinctions from a statistical viewpoint have become more dense. There is highly likelihood for extreme events to happen, and these events are more highly correlated. All these components make more difficult for the risk to be processed by market terms. This on the one hand. On the other hand, how we are answering. First, vaccinations. We have a lot of gaps, not only in terms of access, but also government capacities to move on from 1 to 2 doses, and actually maybe single doses one. Our region is below the average threshold, which is a fundamental problem as a precondition for recovery. Here I must insist upon the fact that when we're talking about recovery, we need to think about greater uncertainty there is. We may not underestimate the importance of going on the recovery path towards economic recovery. We have there are a lot of people who live with less than $10,000 per capita. We need to recover, our countries need to recover a steady path for economic growth as a precondition. But of course, we want to see that this economic quality be different with environmental sustainability and economic growth. Recovery has shown one of the permanent effects I've already talked about. There's higher recovery informally than formally. Recovery is faster in products and services. So this is a call for answering in order to prevent this from becoming permanently. So we live in a highly uncertain world with some permanent effects. So as we've seen, the impact upon poverty is noticeable. And even if we recover towards poverty reduction, there will be a sustained effect. And a piece of work that we had just finished, we see that the effects with information from Mexico learning by children goes from 1 to 3 years in terms of learning, not schooling years. Why? Because those uh, girls and boys with higher economic strata have been able to make up for schools closing, so there is great regional variation and socioeconomic variation. And more importantly, there is an never heard of in terms of nourishment uncertainty. So we have fundamental challenges to respond to. How? Well, I think we need to accompany countries and other developing partners on disaster response plan, which are effective, focused on prevention, rapid response, and we must insist we need to rethink social protection systems which may be universal and be able to respond as a tool for response toward against shocks to avoid permanent effects being put in place. Then we also want to find new policies, new rules and partners to be able to better our rules and policies in order to have a more quicker, more sustainable economic recovery that's also more inclusive as well. We've also seen a couple of ideas in terms of a social agreement that's renewed. Well, it has to be fair or regarded as fair by the stakeholders, sustainable from an economic, social, and environmental standpoint, and it all has to be legitimized by processes seeking rule compliance. This is not an easy task, but calls for governance work in terms of what we are working on as a new governance offer with countries. Now, it's highly important to see that the response plans, here we're talking about PDMAs, where we are working as a UN system with the World Bank, the European Union, to have this component not only being focused on recovering physical structure, but more fundamentally so regarding human capital destruction and other natural capital that may lead to a permanent reduction from these shocks. And this has to be a individual and household related protection against shock, which must be led to rethinking in a more comprehensive, serious way in terms of social mechanisms for protection in a universal way, highly inclusive. That is, that focalization mechanisms should be put in place in order for our programs to reach out to excluded groups, and so that they become universal. Number three, they should be growth friendly, not to work against incentives by businesses, formality and productivity. And number four, they should be fiscally sustainable. All of this need to be under the umbrella of disaster risk reduction and response, with the key response when there are unexpected shock. We need it to detie it from social protection. I mean, sometimes we mix whether or not being poor or with whether or not we are formal. So our programs, we need to make a distinctions across these elements, particularly when there's response against disaster. We need to have mechanisms which do not tie social protection to employment conditions. So if we move forward towards this understanding where we have a new social contract that will lead to greater economic growth, more sustainable, more greener economic growth, a focal point would be include rethinking a logic of how to protect households against systemic shock in such a way that they won't lead to any permanent effects, that which leads to be unequal, that will widen our economic inequalities across the region. So here we have DRR and other partners within and outside the system engaged with this. We will keep on working with other stakeholders in order to build these systems which will protect the most vulnerable ones. Thank you very much for inviting me to this presentation. Thank you very much, Mr. Lopez Calva. As you said, the future is not what it used to be. It's much more complicated what future holds in store for us. This is why investment and acting on with resiliency and effective governance is highly important. And to carry on, we have Mrs. Luis Scala Virginia Ramazo, Secretary for Planning and Programming in the Guatemalan Presidency, CG Plan. You have the floor. Thank you very much. I must send my regards to the DRR and the World Bank Director with whom I will share this panel. Because of time constraints, I move on to my presentation. I was invited here to present the best practices in Guatemala regarding disaster risk reduction for development planning. Guatemala and Plan has sought including risk management for national planning. So please, let's see my presentation. Thank you very much. Let's move on to the following slide, please. Let me tell you about how Guatemala, next slide, please. Thank you. So Guatemala had a development national plan as many other Latin American countries in 2014 towards 2032, focused on disaster management and circular economic value to our natural resources. This national development agenda was integrated with the SDGs, coupling this with other development agendas to see what the national priorities are, including territorial action, and municipal action, including but not limited to disaster risk management as our national priorities. This iteration was embedded into the National Climate Change Council. Guatemala was one of the first countries to have approved a Vulnerability Act in 2013 faced to climate change, and so they created a national council which remained idle for 4 years. This has become active with Mr. Yamanteo's action in Guatemala. Through this national council, we have followed up on the National Climate Change Action with 5 variables for adaptation mitigation. As part of this, we have recently created, as part of this council, we have made sure that planning coming from a national understanding, that is our long-run agenda, we will include it into the ministry plans, strategic plans, sectorial plans, all the way to operation planning in such a way that from the top down we will integrate this commission as part of planning, and also across sectors with development plans, municipal plans, and territorial plans in order to make sure that this will reach out the farthest corner of the country. We must also remember the Paris Accords on climate change. And so as part of this, Guatemala will reiterate the commitment to ameliorate public infrastructure through disaster risk reduction in order for it to become more resilient in the face of climate change. Guatemala from 2008 had also a tool that we've been able to share with ECLAC, referred to as public investment disaster risk management. So Guatemala will coordinate the national public investment program, and so with this tool we will minimize to the infrastructure risk. In 2020, an update was wrapped up with this tool, which has proven so useful to have management embedded into public investment, making sure that This tool will envisage all the potential factors working against the project, all of which is related to project sites with information with mitigation tools based on these results. And so we are looking for the state to reduce their financial efforts in constantly rebuilding this structure. Next one, please. Also, we are aligning our vertical planning in Guatemala, the national plan, and the mitigation. This has been in a municipal way, and so
it has been a territorial reordinance that also works with the development departments, that it's a management action that is lowest in the organization level. These municipality development programs include changes in order to preserve livelihoods in each community. And plans are also built by entities between the government and the territory, social, civil society, the municipalities, and local authorities, and the mayor and the council, and also private sector organizations participate. So this plan proposes municipality activities in order to develop adherent to SDGs, contemplating livelihoods of the community mainly. Also, we can also see the alignment in strategic planning of each of the ministries within the states, but also other institutions such as our Institute for Municipality Promotion that ensure the implementation of the program. These risk reduction actions is considered for public infrastructure institutions and incorporated to the lowest level, which is annual operation plan, and it ensures that there is a budget for each of the institutions. Next, please. The second case, I would like to mention the environmental tax incentives that establishes a complete and effective route map that considers public spending towards adhering to the SDGs, both national and international, and also considers mitigation and adapting efforts that we have in the national plan and the protection of natural resources. This strategy is led by the Ministry of Public Finances, as well as the Ministry of Environment, and the SEGE plan also plays a role of coordination to make sure that this is incorporated to the horizontal and vertical planning that ensures its budget. Environment fiscal strategy, as you can see on screen, has been active for 5 years, and some other countries in Latin America also have it. For example, expenditure quality, public procurement, financial assistance, environmental finances, risk management, and environmental emergencies, and the access to a green future. And last but not least, also I'd like to add that we have added to this environmental fiscal strategy because we believe that it is timely in the relationship that we could have with the national priority contribution in terms of development that have been already mentioned, with the framework of climate change and public policy in the matter, and the comprehensive strategy on risk reduction. These two mechanisms are the ones that I want to share with you, and if I had a little more time, I could share with you the challenges that we have faced. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much, Madam Gramajo. And of course, now we will have time during the debate to be able to talk a little bit further about these challenges. And it is very interesting how you have been able to implement risk reduction and risk management in these 3 municipality plans and the development of this environmental tax or fiscal strategy. To continue, we will have Madam Sena Bursako, Director for Strategy and Operations for Latin America at the World Bank. Good morning, Madam Sako.
Good morning. To be here today with all of you, with Mrs. Misitori, Madam Gramajo, Vilches, and Luis Felipe, my good friend, and all of the colleagues of the UN DRR, Office of the Americas. To add to the diversity, I will have a presentation in English, but I will speak in Spanish. So please bear with me. So if you could help me with the presentation. Noviembre de 2020, ¿no? Dos tormentas, ETA y IOTAS, pasan por Centroamérica.
November 2020, ETA and IOTAS storms go through Central America. April 2021, the eruption of volcano in Santo Vicente and Granadinas affect the entire Caribbean with their ashes. August 2021, the earthquake destroys Lecay in Haiti. And from March 2020, the entire world was stopped by COVID-19. We know already that Latin America and the Caribbean is highly exposed to disaster risk. The region has 1 out of 4 disasters in the world, and the region has been 3 times more affected by COVID pandemic. We also know that faster urbanization and the increase of climate change has aggravated by El Niño phenomenon, imply more human life lost per adverse event. And one of the lessons learned during the pandemic is that the region was not prepared. No one was prepared. But the way lives have been lost shows the dramatic contrast of growth, but also the increase of poverty and inequality. Many years of lack of development have affected in very little time, and that's why I want to emphasize 3 things. And the urgencies that we all have in order to act about prevention. We all know that it takes way less prevent than respond. Next, please. I'm trying to move forward. Second, we have today an opportunity, and it is ensuring that the agenda of economic recovery in the region, as well as of the world, is updated. We are just as the COP in Glasgow is happening. And we want for this to go hand in hand with disaster risk management, but also the climate change agenda. What are we doing at the World Bank for this? This is exactly the challenge, to make sure that everything that we are doing is including the needs of climate change and disaster prevention, disasters that are coming. In the 15 from the agency, we have made available $160 million for assistance to governments in terms of health systems strengthening and social assistance mechanisms, as Luis Felipe already explained, but also how to improve and how to better face this type of pandemic, this type of disasters, and this type of emergencies. And also the other ones that are to come, because what's really clear today is that disasters and pandemics will keep on happening. This is not a question. The question is, first, how are we going to be prepared? And the second, how are we going to learn? And third, how are we going to change? Because maybe this is the hardest challenge. Disasters, we also know, that impact the most vulnerable ones. The most vulnerable, the poorest, women that are Afro-Indigenous peoples, informal people with disabilities. But what are we going to do differently so that today we can at least have an opportunity to meet the vision of our institution, which is eradicating extreme poverty and promote prosperity, shared prosperity, and this is also aligned with the SDGs. This means that without incorporating risk management efforts in everything that we do, we won't be able to make it. Second, this also means that in terms of urban planning, it has to be way more sensitive not to build new risks. For example, at the south of Brazil, we are working with municipalities in order to help them plan a more resilient structure. This means that risk reduction also needs to be a priority in all of the public policies. And in times of tax scarcity, where there is no tax room, it's very hard to get it. A lot of progress has been done in the region in terms of laws, in terms of institutions, just as the new law that was approved in Chile, but also what Haiti has been doing since the earthquake of 2020 and the last one in terms of civil protection. And here I would like to salute and congratulate the work that the UN has done and that's been doing. We have been working hand in hand with the Americas office in Central America in order to have more progress in this map. And I also want to add that only one person cannot do all, or only one institution. We need to further collaborate, we need to further innovate. And it also means that at a global level and at a country level, we need to see more investment in the field. As they say, show me the money. Last but not least, I would like to say that in terms of innovation, financial innovation, we need to offer pioneer instruments, just as we did with the CRIS at a Caribbean level, but also in Central America, with the group of disaster risks. In the case of ELTAN, IORA, the $33 million that were paid to Nicaragua and Panama, and 40 million to Haiti after the earthquake. And we are also moving forward with instruments such as CARICOM bonds, first with the Pacific Alliance and most recently with Jamaica, that's leading the region with this topic. We are also developing a new round of instruments that are for budgetary purposes, such as the CAT EDOs, that are at least incentivizing prevention with more effective plans. And finally, how are we going to work together? Because disasters do not differentiate borders and no one can make it alone. In the private sector to the civil society, from governments, both national, international, regional, global, all the way to international organizations. This is the time to act. And this and more will be required to promote an economic recovery that's greener, more resilient, and more inclusive that the region so desperately needs after COVID pandemic. And we are ready at the World Bank to be able to do more and to do better and to work with all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Madam Sacco. As you very well say, we need to work all together from all sectors, and now it's the time to act. And it is also time for the colloquial. We will have on stage all of the speakers. Please open your mics. And now I would like to start with a question for Madam Misutori. You have mentioned in your intervention that investing in disaster risk reduction is a previous condition for sustainable development and it is efficient from the financial point of view. However, as we've seen from the governments, it appears that they are not providing enough priority to disaster risk reduction. So how do you think that we can promote investment in disaster risk reduction so that public and private investments are informed by risk?
Very much. So I talked about the why in my first presentation, and basically it's because investing in resilience prevention is still seen as a cost. So what about the how in changing this? Well, there are several things that I can indicate here, and I'm very interested to hear about what my other fellow panelists would be suggesting. But first, we need to mainstream disaster risk into public and private investment. national governments, regulators, they need to define sustainable, they need to define what is disaster resilient investment, and put these risk metrics into the broader investments to change the behavior of investors and raise more awareness of disaster risk. This will require financial and investment policy and regulatory reforms, guidance to the market, and coordination across sectors. So I know it's not easy, but that's where we need to reach. Second thing, I said that only 1% of national budgets are on average directed to prevention. So we need to start tracking better what is the actual amount of money that goes into prevention financing, and also to identify the volume of investment utilized out of the budgeted allocation, and importantly, how much of it did it really reach the intended goal, the intended beneficiary. For this, observatories at national, regional, global. Third, I would say we also need to conduct risk-sensitive budget reviews. And this UNDRR has been doing in several countries, in Africa, for example, and we believe that this type of risk-sensitive budget review needs to be scaled up. And it is needed in order to demonstrate the direct and indirect proportion of disaster risk reduction allocation and expenditure in each specific sector. So specific tagging and tracking systems need to be developed and institutionalized. Then we believe there is quite a lot of room to increase the use and application of data around hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and connect it with financial decision making. There are a lot of data out there. I think, the task is how can we bring this data together around, as I mentioned, hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and they need to be formatted in the right way to ensure that they are used by the people who need to use them. And then finally, I would say we really need to work with the private sector. So about the Alliance of Resilient Private Sector for Disaster Risk Reduction, and we work with close to 30 networks worldwide. And they are really interested, engaged, because the private sector, a lot of the companies are very sensitized. They understand the importance of prevention and investing in resilience. So we need to work with them. And of course, we need to work with the insurance sector, because these are the people, the sector which has the most experience in working with risk, and they have the data. So absolutely working with the private sector is crucial. These are some of the lines of work that we need to pursue to promote risk-informed investment. And I do, as I said at the outset, I'm very curious, interested to learn from my very experienced fellow panelists on their opinion on this. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora Mizutori. Y como ustedes ya han comentado, en América Latina y el Caribe tenemos el gran
Thank you so much, Madam Mizutori. As you have said, we are facing a huge challenge of making millions of people to reinsert after this huge crisis, but in a better way, with a focus from digital economy, sustainability, and without leaving anyone behind. So could you please give us concrete examples that are being developed from the different countries, from the UNDP, that allows us to keep more in the agenda for a greener and inclusive agenda? Please, Mr. Calvo. Of course, thank you so much. First, the elements that are very important principles to approach subject number one. This increasing level of uncertainty in terms of risk that brings us to reinforce and rethink our risk management strategies from the prevention and response point of view, and elements that are also related to how to redistribute risk collectively, or how we share risk collectively. We come from a process where risk has been unproportionately distributed, so we need to rethink collectively how to manage risk. And this includes, for example, financial instruments, such as Senabu was mentioning, for how countries are prepared in order to effectively respond to this. And I would insist in the macroeconomic aspect, how are we able to protect households from permanent effects? And a second point, the idea of the emphasis that we've been doing in a GDP or a consumption as a flow, but we also need to think resilience from the point of view of groups and everything that's mediating between heritage and flow is technology. And that's where we are as a UNDP emphasizing. For example, let's talk about technologies that the IMF has already shared. It shows the multiplying effect of multiple technologies that are sustainable drivers for sustainability, which is very important in terms of employment growth and the generation of economic activity. So these solutions based in nature are the ones that we work in the global development of human sustainability. Here at the UNDP, we have talked about the Anthropocene and human beings shaping nature, and I think that this is very important. We have the support to different strategies for renewable transmission energy that include the generation of almost 55,000 jobs. We are working in 9 projects with wind energy, sun with sun energy, geothermal energy, microgeneration, 431 respectively, and also in a community matter, we are connecting them or not to the central network. We are talking about the Anthropocene project. We are talking about renewable energies in the fishery in Argentina or in Mexico City, where we are working in terms of urban sustainability. And I think that it has already been mentioned. It is a very important work how we can create a smart design of urban agglomerations where risks are magnified. We are also talking about in Mexico City, Peru, or Chile, where there are electric buses with terminals for charging, in the case of Chile concretely, or in Brazil, the Credit Warranty Fund for Energy efforts with the SDG that supports design and construction of ecological buildings. And I want to insist that all of these are solutions that are consisting with sustainability and with inclusion. In the Caribbean, we have, besides our acceleration laboratory, where we already have 15 members in the region. In the case of Caribbean, we have the network of economists, the Club Economists Network, and our laboratory is supporting solutions based in nature, for example, for sargassum transformation into fiber that could replace plastic in the mechanisms for packaging and others. So we need to be creative enough, as we are trying to be, so that technology can mediate the relationship between heritage and flow, so these can move forward without further endangering human beings. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Lopez Calva. This is very interesting, you know, to be able to emphasize in creativity and the multiplying effect of technology. And on the other hand, we know that the integration of disaster risk reduction in planning has a huge impact, as we've already seen, and it's able to improve resilience of national sectors and their systems respectively. Madam Gramajo, you have already explained in your presentation the progress that Guatemala has had in this topic. And maybe now if you could share with us the main challenges in order to strengthen the integration of disaster risk reduction in planning aspects. Thank you so much. Yes, one of the main aspects for Guatemala has been also for the entire region, which is funding these actions, because it is already integrated in planning and top, bottom, and horizontally, but it is not considering budgets. In Guatemala, we have a new budget approval from 3 years ago that has meant several challenges to be able to implement that planning. Also, mobilization and leveraging of other actors, many of them from the private sector and civil society, that have added to the conversation. But we need to recognize that there is still a dispersion from the actions that each of sectors do, and that we need to bring them together, as I already mentioned before. Additionally, the data that I was the lady before me mentioned about indicators that could measure the impact, both negative and positive, that these are having, not investing or investing in risk management. Also, Guatemala just published a national damage and losses report on climate change that collects all of the costs in financial terms, especially in terms of infrastructure, for the last 7 decades, since 1940. So it goes up to $6,000 million in losses that could be accounted for. And using the methodology of ECLAC that we have used for many years, facing meteorological phenomena that have affected our country, and also accounting for those losses. And we've seen that this is not translated into the impact that people see. So I would like to ask the regional representative of the General Secretariat, as well as the regional UNDP, in order to assess how can we bring this to term, how can we bring this to people so that they can know what it means not investing in risk management. For example, in a topic that's very close to person, water, quality and amount that we are going to be losing for daily usage as well as for industrial usage, and how much or when this is going to be affected. This important resource is going to be affected because we are not investing in risk management. So the idea is to translate more in terms of material matter, closer to that person, so that we can add to the society in this effort that we are doing with the government institutions. And that'll be all on my part. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Madam Gramajo. And Madam Sacco, as you have already said, the World Bank has been doing a lot of progress through the contingent credit lines. You have already talked about the mechanisms for insurance for catastrophes and disasters, aspects that helps increase the budget and quick disbursement in case of disaster. Could you share what lessons learned you can extrapolate from this, and how they could be further applied to create resilience and to risk to prevention for risk? Disaster risk. Thank you so much. I'd like to add by emphasizing that the bank in the Latin American region and the Caribbean has led this type of funding and disaster risks almost for the last 20 years, right? And what we have learned is that we don't need only one instrument, but many of them that together can maybe provide protection in different areas. And this, from the Hurricane Mitch more than 20 years ago, we have been able to develop specific efforts, including cat bonds at a regional level or at a country level, but also further efforts that not only consider catastrophes, but only pandemics. And this has started from many years with Zika, with dengue, and other type of medical emergencies that the countries in the region have faced. But this COVID crisis, what's not being proven here, is that themselves need to prepare in a most systematic way so that they can respond to possible emergencies. Because what is happening here is that this is not only one or two emergencies, but emergencies worsened by climate change. We would have never imagined that the entire world would have been paralyzed for almost 2 years. And within this, earthquakes and hurricanes do not care about this when the government is already trying to face COVID, and the impact in their health systems and social systems, schools, future, in all of the fiscal aspects. So we need to also elevate the level of preparation. We need to raise it because challenges are not really what were thought before. So I also want to emphasize on the fact that disasters and pandemics will keep on coming. The probability is one. This means that it's something extra, and not something extra that we can do. It's not something emergent that we can do. It's something systematic. And the difference that I see here is that we are moving from disaster risk management or climate change as if it was also only something else that we have to do to the core effort, which is within all of the SDGs, and which is a matter of development. It is not only a matter of environment, it is not only a matter of here and then, or it is a change in the way we are working as an international institution, but also with governments that we are working with and with all of the partners that we are working with. I also want to add at a strategy level, for funding, in terms of disaster risk, we need to prioritize. We need to prioritize, for example, the most vulnerable sectors. Luis Felipe already talked about schools, because we know that the impact that they are going to have on productivity is out there, but also about poverty cycles from one generation to another, which are very important dynamics that we cannot neglect. We need to analyze them, and we need to try to solve them. It also means sectors like tourism, how it has affected the Caribbean economy in a very, very hard way. We need to focus on this type of matters too. It also means that continuity plans for government plans have to be more systematic in terms of the type of scenarios that could happen. And last but not least, we need to maybe spend a little more time on constitutional capability, because for a long time, this is something that has affected response to crisis, and a matter of technology as a way to leverage this multiplying effect, this inclusive effect, because to invest resources on. And another lesson learned maybe is that these type of disasters and crises put in perspective the problems that the region has had for a while. And I'm talking about the low productivity of economies, but also inequality. And today we all have the opportunity to rethink this future, what we have to do, how we can keep on moving forward, and how we can change the levels of productivity and this matter of inclusion. This means that we are at a very complicated time, but we are also at a time that's representing an opportunity to rethink, and maybe we can improve. They all talk about building back better. Maybe it's built forward better, because the past was not pink. It was not a pink bubble. So we could include all of these lessons learned in those designs, in those plans, and in those policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sacco. Now, general question to all our audience and attendees. You have pinpointed a number of leverages which may be helpful in building up greater resilience and inclusion across the region. Out of these factors, which ones have been more advantageous and which ones have posed greater challenges? Mrs. Misutori, if you will, you may have the floor.
So I think the most progress we have made, and this is sadly because of this terrible pandemic combined with the climate emergency, is that there is much more awareness out there, not only in the minds of the government and the private sector, but people on the street thinking that yes, if we could have prevented better, if we could have known better and took action, then so many people would not have had to die. So many livelihoods should not have been lost, and so many children would not have lost their opportunity of education, which will impact them for their whole lives. So I would say that's a part that has moved forward. But the part that has not moved forward is commensurate to that. Still, words have not, or change of mindset has not been translated into action. And I'm really worried about this recovery process, right? Because we keep on saying it has to be green, it has to be resilient, it has to be equitable. But is it really happening that way? We are already seeing quite a lot of studies that say that a lot of money that is being put into recovery is actually not focusing on that. And even when we are in the middle of, or well, when COP just started, there is already a lot of code reds that we see in terms of how we are investing in renewable energy. Will this really continue? Do we always go for the short-termism? So that's the biggest challenge. And if this pandemic, right, that so many of you said we never believed this would be affecting us so much, and everyone, if something like that can't change or can't impact on our action, what can? I would stop there, but I see that as the still biggest challenge. And I think we have the youth challenging us, but have we really accepted that it's a challenge and tried to change things? I'm not sure.
Muchas gracias, señora Mizutori. Señor López Calva, quisiera añadir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lopez Calva. Do you want to add something else? I appreciate it. I think we are singing the same song here. I mean, in terms of what we were talking about a while ago. We're just turning on the 30th anniversary for human development, the Human Development Report, and how they were adamant in terms of the relationship between human activity and nature, and the 3 ways out: incentivizing, mindset shifts, and social norms as a way out. Now we are prepping this new report on uncertainty, on how we can have collective risk management mechanisms. I think this is an important topic to be tied back to your question. Greater uncertainty that we find ourselves in, where there is a perception and something objective to be thinking of this, that is a less capacity to predict things in areas that which takes a toll in economies, political decision making, and social interactions, all of which is greatly important in order to create a political way out that makes somewhat sense, because when citizens are making political decisions in a greater uncertain context where we can favor actions to have the sense of control without the need of it being the more democratizing way out. And I say this because there is a collective consensus of the way out being more inclusive, more sustainable. As this what had already been put back is not the right direction. We need to move forward, inclusive, in an inclusive and more sustainable way. I think here we had a couple of challenges. First, institutional capacities. This is not only capacities per se for yielding results, but also to legitimize institutions. There is fewer confidence by citizens in institutions, and so I believe that these 2 components are very important to be rebuilt, both trustworthiness in institutions and how effective institutions are, and fair. And on the other hand, we have funding. Fiscal realm is quite limited. We need to think out of the box in order to be able to fund the states and their response capacities. And so most definitely will the private sector will play a great role there. And here we need one more time to create the proper conditions for the private sector to move their to make their move and go more sustainable with greater social inclusiveness, which is possible, but which calls for accompaniment and reforms, institutional reforms, which go hand in hand, veering towards that direction. Thank you very much, Mr. Lopez. Mrs. Romajo, I would like to get your take on this. Fully agree with our colleagues in terms of ownership by countries, not only by their societies and their government agencies, among other stakeholders. We have gone great lengths. We have become familiar with this topic. We have put it into planning instruments, not only by Guatemala, but across the region. And the main challenge remains funding, as yes, people have already said. Thank you so much, Mrs. Sacco. Is there anything else you would like to add in this regard? I appreciate it. Yes, I could only agree with their previous statements. Maybe in progress by institutions, by financial instruments, and so on. There, we are able to see the extent to which the Haiti earthquake was addressed in 2021 versus 2020, but there are a couple of issues, including governance and safety and security, which remain to be addressed. Now, where we need to work further, I think, is the urgency to change, whether by the government, by people, by the world. We haven't talked enough about this, but I think this remains really important. How can we better prepare on an international level where we know that institutional capacities remain very low, where we won't have as many financial incentives. Now, this is on a national scope, also on a regional scope, local scope, where we know that there are economic, political scopes which are which vary from region to region. All of these can be seen, and the instructions and directions that are part of COP. How can we then harmonize these outputs in order to make a difference? There is still a lot of work to do. I also think that there's a lack of focus because we know that there are a number of vulnerable people which has exacerbated from the middle class, and then as a result of this shock, their poverty threshold they're getting back into, right? So we know with this crisis where the poverty is, where the most vulnerable ones are, whether indigenous peoples, whether people in the coast, which are and remain more vulnerable to climate change. I think there must be a lot to do here in terms of inclusion, because this will be key, as said by Luis Felipe, to social tissue sustainability. When we're talking about prioritizing, we need to deal with the kind of country, kind of future, and kind of world that we want to have. And so this remains the core of the matter, how we can reach a political decision making that would address the question is the question in and of itself. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is quite inspiring, Mrs. Sacco. And so we are reaching the end of the session. Just a couple of last remarks. Heading to the ministry meeting, can you mention a couple of rebuilding actions for a more greener more inclusive, more resilient societal reconstruction. Mrs. Mitsutori, do you want to take the floor first?
Yes, so I think that the government, which is at the end of the day, of course, Sendai says that risk is everybody's business and we need a whole society approach. But the government, and especially the national government, needs to lead the way. And one very concrete recommendation or just plea, if I may, is that we need to change the way that we operate from having a sector to sector vision about risk. Or if I may be a bit more radical about this, we can't leave the business of risk to the national disaster risk management authorities, because these authorities do all they can do, but many times they are not big enough, they do not have enough funding, and importantly, they are responsible for everything from prevention to response to reconstruction. And they're overwhelmed. During the COVID time, most of the national disaster risk management agencies in most countries, they were just, up to here with dealing with the COVID-19 response. And so to ask them to, okay, please look into the prevention of the next pandemic. All of this, the risk is connected. We call it systemic risk. It means that, all the ministries in charge of different sectors, they need to come together and think about risk-informed agriculture policy, risk-informed education policy, risk-informed trade policy, and need to coordinate with the agency in charge of national risk. And importantly, at the highest level of the political world, i.e. the prime minister or the president, this whole has to come together. So that's what we've been talking about for a long time, but that hasn't happened. And that's why we are seeing what we are seeing right now during COVID. So, and I'm not saying that all governments are like that, but there is a tendency. So I think this is my biggest, plea.
Muchas gracias. Señor López Cava, su conclusión.
Muchas gracias. Y siendo muy breve.
Conclusions, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to keep it brief. Speak about concrete, specific actions, but something else that remains is the fact that this is a systematized governance problem and challenge where we need vision and political leadership, political commitment towards the kind of recovery that we want to have, political processes, including number of stakeholders, to create the way out, because the way out wouldn't be inclusive if the process in of itself isn't inclusive. We need political engagement, and also here we can have accompanying multilateral organizations towards this political engagement and with complementary stakeholders, because processes need to be inclusive in order for the new normality and way out to be inclusive as well. And for example, the private sector will also need to take a part of it, all of which is important. Thank you very much. Yes, we need to have an inclusive process in order to legitimize these new processes. Mrs. Zamajo, your conclusions, please, if you don't want to mind. Indeed, I shall join my colleagues. We need leveraging other stakeholders, most notably from the private sector, international funding, for the most vulnerable countries such as Guatemala, because we're highly vulnerable to climate change, and we and other countries we may have access to because they're funds. However, these have been very difficult to access by our country, and so we, as a region, as Central America, from the CICA and CCAD platform and the conference, we're pleading for the Latin American and Caribbean region be declared as a high risk region. There are other world banks who already are outlining most vulnerable countries as insular countries, but for which there are no dedicated funding for more vulnerable countries towards climate change who are suffering the most. So yes, we need to add this to the conversation. Also, I'd like to seize the opportunity to thank you for this opportunity and to be able to talk to you today. Thank you very much, Mrs. Aramajo. Mrs. Sacco, closing remarks, please. Thank you very much. We need to act now without leaving anybody behind. That's crystal clear. Second, disaster risks such as climate change, we know them to be as key to development. This is not an extra thing to do. This will need to be included as part of plans, funding, and other programs, including also all the perspectives that the countries are looking at. Finally, I believe that this is the opportunity to look ahead of us, to think of the future. This is our pathway at the bank, the kind of world that we want, whether or not we want to have a greener, more resilient, more inclusive future. We want it so to be. We need to invest further. Thank you very much. This is all I have for closing remarks. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, what kind of future we want to have, right? How we're going to engage accordingly. Mrs. Misutori, Mr. Lopez Calva, Mrs. Damajo, Mrs. Sacco, thank you all very much for partaking with us today. I must thank you. Without further ado, we are hopeful in our work by every one of us towards this new stage of affairs, this golden opportunity, as you called it. I think that this is a very fruitful debate that we're talking about. I'm sure that all the lessons learned and experiences will be helpful in building up more resilient economies towards this new future. So without further ado, we hope you continue partaking in this platform. To me, it's been a pleasure being able to join you guys, and I thank you. Have a good morning, good afternoon, good night.